thank you all for coming to the final Friday lecture at the Center for European Studies at UNC-Chapel Hill. Nora would have you know that we have saved the best for last, and we're appreciating this full audience here. It's really great.
So let's start with introductions. I'm introducing Dr. Jelena Subotic. She is a associate professor of political science at Georgia State University in Atlanta. She works on international relations theory, human rights, transitional justice, identity politics, and the Balkans. She wrote a book titled Hijacked Justice, Dealing with the Past in the Balkans. It looks at how domestic elites in the former Yugoslavia used international norms of transitional justice for local political purposes. She's a frequent commentator. This is really cool. She's a frequent commentator on war crimes in the Balkans, unlike CNN and cool other channels. And she also worked with NGOs in Serbia. So please welcome her. And Isha is going to introduce the second very, very interesting speaker.
Yes, I'm here to introduce Mr. Dusan Jovanovic, who graduated from law school in Belgrade and is a legal expert on war crimes and justice in the Balkans. He's previously done a lot of work with NGOs in Belgrade, specifically on war crimes research. Recently, he was in an OSCE outreach program involving educating Serbian youth on their recent past. And currently he's working on a project monitoring war crimes and trials in Serbia. And I'm not sure how thrilled he will be with me sharing this, but he does have a limited expertise on Myanmar. Thought that was interesting. He'll have you know he's not an expert by any means, but I thought it was worth mentioning. So thank you all again for coming, and now I'll turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you. I would like to thank the Center for European Studies in Milada for inviting me to speak here. Again, I would like to encourage you to get involved in this panel as much as possible. I'm not here to claim that I have any answers to the situation in the Balkans, far from it. And I'm not sure if anybody has solutions for our problems. But this is one of the ways to think about them and try to find solutions. I will speak about challenges of dealing with the past in the former Yugoslavia, and I identified two biggest challenges. I'm not saying that we don't have other challenges, but two biggest challenges are here on the right: conflicting narratives and lack of interest. Yugoslavia used to be one country up until 1991. And now there are 7 countries there. From 1991 until 2001, we had armed conflicts in different parts of the former Yugoslavia that claimed around 130,000 lives. Millions of people were ethnically cleansed from their homes. Thousands were tortured, raped. We still have over 10,000 missing persons who are considered to be missing. So there's a lot of dealing with the past to be done. Unfortunately, we're not doing a great job in the former Yugoslavia when it comes to transitional justice or dealing with the past, whatever term you prefer. Each ethnic group in the former Yugoslavia has its own narrative about the war and war crimes that happened in the 1990s. And these narratives, all of them, are factually wrong. They are conflicting, opposing each other. And I think that they produce even more problems for the future in terms of conflict prevention, but also in terms of dealing with those war crimes. When you have different narratives in all these different ethnic groups, then we cannot really come to terms with our past. We cannot establish facts. For example, each ethnic group is trying to maximize the number of their own victims and minimize the number of victims from other side. We call it Victims Olympics, where you try to claim that you have more victims than you actually do, your own ethnic group, because that brings you some moral high ground, and it gives you space for political demands. For example, in Bosnia, Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims, are the largest victims group. Around 100,000 people were killed in Bosnia alone. Out of that, around 64,000 were Bosniaks. And we have this book called the Bosnian Book of the Dead, in which an NGO conducted the research, and they listed all these people who were killed by names. So we know who was killed. Unfortunately, we still have politicians in Bosnia who try to manipulate the number of victims. For example, Bosnian Minister of Foreign Affairs recently wrote an article for the New York Times in which he claimed that there were 300,000 victims in Bosnia alone. So that's one of the problems with the narratives. Let's say in Serbia, on the other hand, we have a problem of recognizing that Serbia was involved in the wars in the former Yugoslavia. That Serbia contributed to war crimes that were occurring in Croatia or Bosnia. We hardly ever speak about war crimes committed by the Serb side in Kosovo. This is Serbia and Bosnia, and even the worst situation is in Kosovo, where you basically have no mention of war crimes committed by Kosovo Albanians against Serbs. And that situation is not going to change easily. It is the intellectuals who manufacture these narratives. It wasn't just the politicians. The politicians are using these narratives for their own political gain and manipulation, but it is not them who came up with the narratives. The other big challenge is lack of interest. Very few people care about dealing with the past in the former Yugoslavia. Let's say people like Jelena and myself, people working at different NGOs throughout the region from all different ethnic groups who deal with transitional justice, we're some sort of a guerrilla. We shoot from the woods from time to time, we fire a few bullets, but that's it. Nobody pays attention. We are not an organized force. Nobody listens to us. Nobody wants to deal with these issues anymore. It's been over 10 years since all those wars ended, and now the politicians and the international community, everybody's switching their focus to something else. So these are those 6 stakeholders that are somewhat invested in transitional justice and dealing with the past in the former Yugoslavia, and I would briefly like to touch upon each of them to see how they influence the debate about the past. So we have Western international community, that is the EU and the US. Basically, they don't care that much about war crimes anymore. They did care in the past for a number of reasons, but now they care about other issues. They care about corruption. They care about independent judiciary. Because as these countries of the former Yugoslavia move closer to the EU, that means that they will be getting money from the EU funds. So the EU wants independent judiciary and minimum corruption in the former Yugoslavia so that the money coming from the EU funds will be safe. It is pretty much same with the US. They want their investments in the region to be safe. So they invest money, they invest energy, the Western international community invests all that into the region when it comes to corruption, organized crime, independent judiciary, but simply they don't invest any more money or energy to dealing with the past. From time to time, we see some improvements in that. For example, this year the European Commission published a progress report on Serbia, in which it pointed out to some problems when it comes to dealing with the past in Serbia, which is a good thing. But nobody puts war crimes and dealing with the past on the top of their agendas. It's pretty much the same with local politicians in the former Yugoslavia. If you get into all these war crimes stories, if you speak about that in public, you're probably not getting any political points. So nobody is going to speak about that. Politicians would much rather speak about economy, or just insult their opponents like politicians do, but they will not really put any high stakes on war crimes. We even have this notion now in the former Yugoslavia, let's turn to economic cooperation between these different states, let's forget the past. Unfortunately, that's what we did after World War II. When the Tito formed this new socialist Yugoslavia, mass crimes were committed during World War II on the territory of the former Yugoslavia, not just by Nazis, but also by different armed groups of different ethnic nations were committing crimes against each other. Somehow the communist regime decided that it would be best to somehow forget about all those crimes, not to talk about them that much, so that we can form new unity in the country, unity between different ethnic groups. It seemed to be working for a few decades, and then all hell broke loose in the late 80s when everybody started manipulating with World War II. It was especially the intellectuals. Then we come to this third stakeholder. In my view, they are the biggest problem because it is them who created the narrative. It is them, and that's the opinion polling that the OSCE conducted shows that it is the intellectuals who influence people attitudes towards war crimes, people attitudes towards recent past. The problem is that you cannot influence intellectuals. You cannot influence these university professors from the region to change their views on the past. They are hardcore nationalists usually, those who influence the debate, those whom people listen to. And you know, professors are opinionated. They will not change their mind easily. So how do we deal with them? I don't really think that we can deal with them. I think that's a lost cause. The problem is that, of course, they're now old people, but they have their students, their assistants, whom they've been teaching. I mean, I came to law school in 2001, and pretty much, but the Belgrade Law School is considered as the hardcore nationalistic spot. But even in family law, you have a subject called family law. Even in family law, they would speak about great Serbian past and how Serbs have been suffering throughout the history and how these ethnic groups are not so, different ethnic groups are not so good to the Serbs. You know, even in subjects like ancient Roman law, you would hear these stories that had nothing to do with the topic. They are the problem, and we have, of course, intellectuals who are different, who have different views, very progressive, very open-minded, based on facts, but they are the minority. They are not silent, quite the contrary, they're very vocal, but they usually do not get invited to talk shows at the national television stations and things like that. The fourth stakeholder is the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY. The ICTY did help in many ways to establish facts and to end this culture of impunity in the former Yugoslavia. Without the ICTY, there would be no war crimes trials in the former Yugoslavia, and that's a given. But in the past year or two, the ICTY made some blunders, which will cost the ICTY a great deal, but it will also hinder the process of dealing with the past in the region. Some high-ranking generals were acquitted under, well, let's say very... I don't think that they actually should have been acquitted. There was evidence against those generals that they did commit certain crimes, but in the end of the day they were acquitted and nobody can explain why. And the victims associations in the region...
I'll explain why.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, okay. I cannot say that I know why. I can have my... Yeah, I can suspect, but I can really say it. So the ICTY had no outreach project in the region up until 10 years ago. Nobody knew what the ICTY was doing, even though the ICTY accused 161 persons for war crimes, which is a lot. And those were high-ranking commanders, politicians, people who orchestrated the crimes, who planned. all those crimes, which is a good thing. But with these acquittals, it seems that the ICTY and its legacy will be really bad in the region. It will not work. Then we have domestic judiciaries that are supposed to deal with war crimes now. We should have war crimes trials in the region of the former Yugoslavia. We have war crimes trials in each of these countries, but the prosecutors are really not that keen on prosecuting mid-level or high-level commanders from their own ethnic groups. We still have that sense that we're trying to protect our own. Nobody says it, but you can see that from the indictments. Prosecutors are willing to prosecute those persons who actually fired the gun and killed somebody, but they are not willing to prosecute commanders who gave the orders or commanders who orchestrated large ethnic cleansing processes in the former Yugoslavia. Of course, they are not willing to prosecute people of their own ethnic group. And finally, local civil society organizations. I think without them, probably there would be also no war crimes trials in the region, because it was local civil society organizations that collected all these evidence, facts, victims' testimonies about the crimes. They were the ones that brought together victim groups from different nations. They were the ones who pointed out to somebody's criminal responsibility for war crimes. They're still doing that, but it seems that nobody listens anymore. You cannot expect too much from civil society organizations. They can do as much, and they did. So what I'm somewhat proposing for solutions are those three over there: regional approach, education, and pressure. Regional approach means that since all those wars were regional, in a sense that, for example, if there was war in Croatia, you would have troops from Serbia also involved in that war. Or if you had war in Bosnia, you would have the troops from Serbia and Croatia involved in that war. Or again, war in Croatia, you would have Serb refugees from Croatia who were ethnically cleansed by the Croatian army coming to Serbia and now living in Serbia. You have evidence about war crimes in one country and victims in another country, perpetrators in one country, victims in a different country, and so on. So we need a regional approach to these problems. I don't think that any of those 7 countries can deal with its past of the 1990s by itself. We have to do it together. One of the ways to do it is this process called the RECOM process, which is an abbreviation for Regional Commission, RECOM. Civil society organizations proposed that states of the former Yugoslavia establish a regional, international Truth and Reconciliation Commission, basically, something similar to what South Africa had after apartheid. That commission would have the mandate to establish facts about war crimes, in terms to list all persons who were killed during the war by their names, so we don't have manipulation with the numbers of victims, to list all camps where people were tortured. It would have this final report about all these war crimes, and that final report should become part of history textbooks in all these countries of the former Yugoslavia. That commission would consist of members of every ethnic group in the region. It would have live hearings of victims, where victims would come before the commission and tell their stories, victims from all groups, and national TV stations would be obliged to broadcast those live hearings, so that Serbs in Belgrade hear Bosniaks or Croats or Kosovo Albanians telling stories about crimes committed by the Serb army and vice versa. Hopefully, I think that's our best chance if we actually succeed in forming that RECOM. Then we have some chance of actually reconciling in the region, because we would have the same narrative. We would know the number of victims, we would know where the camps were, people would finally hear each other, people from different ethnic groups. Another way to deal with the past is education. But from my own experience, that would be education of the so-called future decision makers. So young people in the region of the former Yugoslavia who are political youth, who are best students at their faculties, people for whom we presume that one day will occupy high offices and will be making certain decisions relating to the past, so that they can make informed decisions one day, unlike politicians today, so that they are sensitized to these issues. And we did have certain success in that when working with these young people, because when you bring them to a 5-day intensive seminar and you talk about war crimes constantly for 5 days, they usually say, well, we didn't know about this. You know, you don't hear it in the media, you don't hear it in your house, you don't hear it at school, all these different stories. You only hear about crimes committed against your own nation, you're somehow always trying to protect your own. That's the general feeling, the collective feeling. And the third way to deal with the past, I would think, is pressuring or encouraging politicians in the former Yugoslavia, but also Western international community to focus more on these issues. I'm not really talking about stick and carrot. I think that they actually need the incentive, that they need to be explained that dealing with the past is important, and if we have a regional approach, if, for example, Serbia and Croatia are cooperating on these issues, if politicians from Serbia and Croatia are cooperating on these issues, then none of those politicians are losing any points. If we say we're going to find missing persons from your side, you're going to find missing persons from our side, then how is that losing points? But they have still some reluctancy to deal with that. So yeah, I think I'm going to, it's about 15 minutes. Yeah, I think I'm going to end now, and then we can continue after Jelena.
Okay, well, this was great, and so Dusan said everything there was to say. So I'm going to just say a few more things, and then I'm going to move this potential optimism to a kind of downward spiral of despair, because that's just my gig. Okay, so I agree with Dusan's analysis 100%. So I want to kind of maybe repeat something, just put it kind of in a little bit of different framework. So for those of you who are political scientists, I want to kind of speak your language a little bit, just throw your bone. So I think that there were three main structural reasons why transitional justice in the former Yugoslavia has been so difficult. I'm not quite ready yet to say that it has failed as a project, but it certainly has not met its expectations. So the first thing, and Dusan talked about this at length, is that there was no domestic demand from below. A lot of the expectations from human rights scholarship and from transitional justice scholarship and from people like Catherine Sicking and activists beyond borders and that whole literature is that after conflict ends or after authoritarianism transitions to democracy, there will be domestic coalitions around victims groups or human rights groups that will then connect with international NGOs and will build up this swell of domestic interest in uncovering the crimes or in dealing with human rights reform. That has not happened. So now we have cases in the former Yugoslavia where the main part of this chain of argument, domestic demand from below, doesn't exist. So the question is, why wasn't there domestic demand for dealing with crimes of the past? Dusan talked about a lot of them. I want to add a few. The concept of the war has not been delegitimized in much of the former Yugoslavia. When people in Serbia talk about atrocities that were committed under the regime of Slobodan Milosevic, they blame him for losing the war, not for waging the war in the first place. Very similar dynamic is in Croatia. The discussion is about why did we have to lose so many casualties? The issue was not why did we commit atrocities. So the idea that political problems can be solved through violent means has not been delegitimized. So when people look at the past, they don't see it as necessarily a mistake of judgment. They see it more as a mistake of implementation. So when you start from that profound difference about what the past means, it's not that hard to understand why there was no domestic demand for change. The other very simple structural reason why former Yugoslavia was different from some other cases in the past where transitional justice was more successful, like South Africa or maybe Argentina or maybe Chile, is that former Yugoslavia ended in partition. So we now have 7 different countries. So victims live in a different country than their perpetrators. Now Bosnia, of course, is different, but even in Bosnia there's internal segregation with Republika Srpska, where majority Serbs live, and the Bosnian Federation, where Bosniaks and Croats live. So you did not have that organic demand for social cohesion. You didn't have the demand of people to live in peace with their neighbors because their neighbors lived in a different country. So they could live in complete, splendid isolation from them forever. They never had to face them. So the concept of reconciliation or keeping the country together through facing the past that was necessary to keep South Africa from brutal civil war was absent. So I think a lot of the human rights scholarship was built on the South African and Latin American examples, and that's why it just doesn't work in a lot of the former. We now have 7 different countries. So that, I think, is important. The second structural reason that it was difficult in the former Yugoslavia to kind of move on with the transitional justice project is that transitional justice became hijacked by local political elites, and it became kind of electoral currency. It became just one electoral issue, like the economy or Social Security or, Obamacare. It got devalued as a profound normative change and just became something that you talk about in the election year. Now, that shouldn't be surprising to us who are political scientists. Of course, political elites are going to use different issues to pursue their different agendas. But the hope of the international transitional justice movement was that the facing the past would be such an overwhelming normative shift that it would not become politicized. That, of course, has failed. And then finally, again, this should sound familiar, there were a lot of regime spoilers, old regime veto players that easily transformed from the Milosevic regime or Tudjman regime into the new post-democratic regimes. Same people were the head of security agencies. A lot of the same people were head of the military. A lot of the same people were in the media. So they would not have any incentive to investigate crimes against themselves. So there was no clear break. In any of the countries, Serbia probably is the worst, there was no clear break between the past and the future. It was a slow mutation, if you will, towards something that really is not a liberal democracy, but some kind of a hybrid democracy. Other things that I think are really important, the role of the media, the role of the education system, the role of the church, which we didn't mention. Dusan talked about the media. I think the issue there is lack of interest, of course, media for ratings and all that. But I think there's even a lack of expertise on how to investigate war crimes. So when war crimes trials are going on, either at The Hague or in domestic judiciaries, the media almost always focuses on the perpetrator. And usually the story is about he was hiding, he had support, or this is how he was caught. It's a kind of detective investigative story about how we caught the perpetrator. What the perpetrator did, the story about the victims, the story about the context in which the crime occurred, who ordered the crime, why did this person listen to the orders, is almost always missing from the analysis. So even if media does cover war crimes, it covers them really like a mobster trial. There's no interest or effort put into actually explaining the context in which the crimes occurred. Education is a big issue, and I've written a lot about the way in which the past is taught in textbooks. Textbooks are really a very good kind of predictor illustrator, I should say, of state narratives. I mean, the state narratives are constructed and they're constructed through education. This is what the state wants you to believe, and the way in which history, not only of the recent past, but history of the more distant past, of World War II, or even hundreds years ago, is described in the textbooks of the region is nothing short of a scandal. There are widely inaccurate descriptions about events of the 1990s. There's no contextualization. There's no explanation of the political processes. It's all self-victimization. And I'll give you an example from the Serbian media. Even things that you would not think would be that controversial in 2013, like the Holocaust, are explained in Serbian textbooks in a way that is really shocking. Holocaust as biggest crime of the 20th century is described in contemporary Serbian high school textbooks as a crime against the Serbs, mainly. I wish I was kidding. And if there were victims who were among the minorities, such as Jews or Roma, they were killed because they supported their Serbian friends. Okay? Now, there was a groundswell of opposition by these progressive historians to this kind of depiction of the Holocaust. They wrote a letter to the editor of the textbook series explaining how this is not a proper way to study the Holocaust. The response was that this story is overblown because we all know that a Holocaust happened in Northern Europe and not in the South. Okay? So I'm using this example just to show you the level of history education discourse that children read every day, today. Okay, this is 2013. So if this is how you can discuss the Holocaust, it's not really shocking that you cannot discuss Srebrenica. All right. The role of the church has been very pernicious in the region, in Serbia as well as in Croatia. The church has really adopted and promoted the story in Serbia, of Serbian supremacy against many other ethnic groups, of Serbian historic desire for justice and vindication as a special kind of people. The church, since the 1990s, has become the most trusted institution in Serbian society. The next is the military. And so again, this is what people talk to their parishioners from a position of authority. The church has been very opposed to Serbia's recognition of Kosovo. It has presented many obstacles to negotiation of Kosovo recognition. In Croatia, the Catholic Church has also been very defensive when it comes to Croatian war crimes, and has really played this story about the necessity of Croatian war for independence because Croatia is so different from everybody else. It's Catholic, it's European. So this is important only because the church is so respected. It wouldn't be that important if people didn't care, but people do care, and they increasingly care more. Okay, so now how am I doing on time? All right, so I'm going to talk about two things, and then I'll end. So the first thing is to talk a little bit about this ICTY scandal, or non-scandal in my view, and explain why I have a somewhat different view about what happened. And then I'm going to end with my plea to think about transitional justice and responsibility for mass atrocity in somewhat different ways than we have so far. All right, so the ICTY. So this is the scandal. The ICTY acquitted people who should not have been acquitted, or who everybody expected to acquit. So do I need to go into, okay, a little bit? Okay,
problem.
All right. So in November 2012, within a scope of a couple of weeks, the ICTY acquitted two generals from the Croatian army who were accused of committing crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing of almost all of Croatian Serbs in 1995. There was a shock through the entire region because they were always expected to be convicted because there was a lot of witness testimony and documentation testimony. Within a couple of weeks, one of the major Kosovar politicians, also accused of crimes against the Serbs, was also acquitted. His case was particularly interesting because this was a retrial because there was a lot of evidence of witness tampering and intimidation. So basically mistrial. A couple of months later, a Serbian general who was in charge of the siege of Sarajevo, for example, and some other atrocities, was also acquitted. And this was a particularly important decision, I think, because the court said that there was no clear evidence that the army of Bosnian Serbs actually received orders from Serbia. That kind of the Bosnian Serbs were on their own doing their own thing, and that Serbia knew a little bit, but not enough to actually prosecute a Serbian general. This was very big deal in the region for a couple of reasons. It fed into these competing narratives. So Croatians could now say, well, of course we didn't commit any crimes because the ICTY said that all our generals are innocent. Serbs could take that same decision and say, we've been telling you all along that the Hague Tribunal was biased against us. Here, there's another example. So it helped each other. Same about the Kosovo and same about the last Perišić ruling. But this is where I think the criticism of the ICTY is a little bit misguided. The expectations on the court to be a political body and a body that provides peace and reconciliation existed from the very beginning. Part of it the court brought on itself. The problem is this is just the court. The only thing that this court can do is look at the evidence against one individual in front of them. This court doesn't write history. This court does not talk about the context of larger innocence, guilt, or responsibility of the Serbian regime. They talk about one person. In a lot of these cases, I think the blame, if any blame, should rely more on the prosecutor, on the type of charges that were brought. Maybe if the charges were more limited, maybe if the charges were, how you bring Al Capone, you bring Al Capone on tax evasion, you don't bring him on, So I think there was a lot of overreach, over-exuberance of prosecution that was trying to, make these cases be the final word about what has occurred in the former Yugoslavia. But the reason why I think this is relevant is that the ICTY was the most visible and still is the most important element or agent of transitional justice in the region. The international community relied on the ICTY and cooperation of these countries with ICTY as an indicator of cooperation with the Copenhagen criteria, which are necessary for countries to get into the EU. So the entire process of transitional justice was reduced to really an international tribunal. This is too much responsibility and too much of a burden for a court to bear. This is neither its responsibility, neither its cause. This is just the court. Think about this as a traffic court. This is just the court. It's also important because the domestic NGO community in Serbia as well as in Croatia relied so much on the court in The Hague to be its force multiplier. Now that this court is actually acquitting people that we all kept telling people are guilty, we lose credibility. So this is why we're mad at the court. But again, this is just the court. They had the evidence in front of them. It is very difficult to find evidence of genocide and ethnic cleansing. People don't usually write a report in which they say, I want to ethnically cleanse you. Okay? So the court does what a court does. Do we have evidence that this person ordered genocide? No. Okay, you go home. It's painful for us to watch, but there are different levels of responsibility other than criminal one. So I want to end with this, because this is like my big thing. I think that we're thinking about responsibility for mass atrocity all wrong. We're thinking about responsibility for mass atrocity as individual responsibility of people. And there's been a big move within the world of human rights from arguing, like we did in the past, that states are guilty. Now, after World War II, Germany was guilty, we had a guilt clause. We moved away from that at Nuremberg to provide individual responsibility, that actually individual people are responsible. And now this idea that we should look at responsibility for mass atrocity as individual criminal responsibility has taken hold as the primary regulation of human rights. But there's a big mismatch, I believe, between individual responsibility of a perpetrator for collective crimes. So we are dealing with collective crimes of groups against other groups because they are groups by putting individuals on trial. I don't think we should get rid of that, but I think there should be just one, maybe the lowest part on the pyramid of importance of multiple levels of accountability for mass atrocity. So I think we should have individual responsibility of perpetrators who committed the atrocities, of those who ordered the atrocities, of those who created the policy in which the atrocities were made. We should keep that. But I think we should have a second level of responsibility, the state accountability. We should have states be accountable for atrocities that were committed as part of major state projects. These people who committed these atrocities didn't come up with this idea by themselves. They acted on behalf of the state. This was their job on behalf of the state. States are responsible. States should pay reparations. States should pay for broken homes and schools and roads and parks in another country. I think I should pay from my taxes for the devastation in Iraq or Afghanistan. I, as a citizen, acted and paid taxes for the state project that has committed atrocities. So the third level, I think, individual, state, is the societal level of responsibility. So what we're talking about here, we're trying to figure out how do we change people's minds to have them get out of their own narrative and accept somebody else's. You cannot do that through an individual trial of some guy from Bosnia. There's a mismatch. Here is where the Truth Commission comes in. Here's where education reform comes in. This is where media reform comes in. This is where we should rename our streets after victims of our own atrocities, so that when people take the bus, they have a destination to go, and the street bears the name of an atrocity site. But these are all separate levels. And I think the problem is that we have reduced this entire project to only one. And we are judging the success or failure of the Transitional Justice Project based only on retributive justice, on retribution, instead of a larger reparative justice of ways in which we need to repair society. And I am done. Yep.
Dusan, do you want to jump in with any?
Well, I respectfully disagree with your views on the ICTY and why these journalists were acquitted. I think that it wasn't the prosecutor to be blamed. I think it is the judges to be blamed. But I think that's a fairly legal issue, and we can go into that if somebody actually wants us to explore it any further, but other than that. As for retribution, I would just add that when I was working at an NGO in Belgrade, we tried to push for reparations for victims on the basis of state accountability, and it didn't work out. It doesn't work in any of the states because it means admitting your accountability for crimes, which is a very huge step for any state to admit its own accountability for the crimes of the past. But it also involves money. It involves the state budget. So the state would have to allocate millions of euros to certain reparations project. Recently, Slovenia, pressured by the European Court of Human Rights, decided to pay reparations for certain individuals who were stripped of their citizens' rights in 1991, when Slovenia declared independence. And they will probably have to pay around 130 million euros, maybe even more than that. So it is a big problem. I'm not saying that I have any sort of sympathy towards the states for not exploring this any further, but I just wanted to add that. That's pretty much it. I have nothing else.
Great. So let's open this up for questions. How much time do we have? Let's see. Yeah, we have a fair amount of time, so let's just take one question at a time. And please remember you need the microphone before you start speaking. Right back, your turn.
Hi. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the three levels of accountability that you mentioned. I think it's an intriguing idea, but I'm wondering, on a practical standpoint, if you need to hold a government accountable as sort of this second level, I mean, how do you avoid the trap that Germany fell into between World War I and World War II, where holding a state accountable leads to further atrocities down the line? And also secondarily, how do you set sort of tangible benchmarks that the EU or someone else could use to say this process is moving forward when you have all of these different levels that I agree should be held accountable?
Okay, well, I do say this is the reality. I just, girl can dream. So this is kind of where I'm coming from. But it's really more born out of my frustration with the idea that we have elevated the individual accountability to this throne. But I do think that there are some practical ways in which this could work. So I'm okay with the individual staying as it is, but again, just as one. On the state level, I actually didn't say it was the government's. I didn't say government responsibility. I said state responsibility. So I think the United States is responsible for the crimes of the Bush regime. Doesn't matter that Obama's in office. These crimes were done as crimes of the United States. So this is actually state responsibility. So I think that new governments, even governments that come in after a criminal regime, continue to have responsibility as the state. So to me, it doesn't matter that in post-Tudjman Croatia or in post-Milosevic Serbia, these were new governments that, at least nominally opposed the previous government. These are crimes done in the name of the state. And one other thing, that the state has benefited from, okay? So we have all benefited from a lot of atrocities that we have committed in the United States. But Serbia has benefited territorially, for example, from crimes. So that remains regardless of the regime change. So I mean, reparations, of course, it's a financial issue, and that was the German example. But I think there are other more creative ways that we can think about this. Reparations are one, but I mean, I really do believe that we could put in a budget, and we should put in a budget as part of your moral obligation, paying for the mess that you have created. There's no reason that Serbia should not be required to fix up Vukovar. We destroyed that place. I paid, as then Serbian citizens, my taxes went into the government budget that the government then used to blow up Vukovar. I have responsibility as an individual citizen, but also the state has the responsibility to fix up what it has broken. I mean, I think that's a much better way to do it than individual reparation, filing for individual reparations as a family. That's a separate issue. But actual, if we put the military endeavor in the budget, we should put the cleanup in the budget. So I think that there are creative ways to, we should create parks in Bosnia. We should create parks in Iraq. We should build up schools. We should build up schools in the places that we drone. We should do that. I mean, I really believe that. Okay. I'll pay for it from my taxes. I'll volunteer. And then the societal one, that's always the tricky because, I presented this idea many times. Everybody always hates it. And the criticism that I always get is, you're just repeating the kind of collective guilt and all of that. But again, these crimes are not created in a vacuum. These politicians were popular for a reason. Milosevic won in elections. Now, these were not fair and balanced, but his popularity was quite high. He did not overtake by coup and implemented policies that nobody agreed with. His policies, his criminal policies, had broad domestic support. Okay, so we are all responsible. And again, this is not. I'm making this kind of trilogy, but all I'm doing is I'm stealing from Karl Jaspers, and I'm talking about the question of German guilt, where he talked about as four-part responsibility of the German people after the Holocaust: the criminal responsibility of individuals, the political responsibility of members of the Nazi Party, and then the metaphysical responsibility of all of them who survived. Because he said, I have survived. I'm a German person who survived. None of my friends did. I have a metaphysical responsibility to make the world better. This is what I, as a survivor, have to offer to the world. And I really think that we, as survivors or non-perpetrators, we have a responsibility to make the world better because we benefited from criminal policies.
No?
At the back.
How do you speak into it?
Just you can speak. That's
Okay.
good.
So we've been talking in Dr. Vakudova's class about having an American general as the main prosecutor in some of these cases, and I was just wondering how you think this may have influenced the acquittals given the U.S.'s more recent notoriety in like war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, if you think it has any influence at all. And this is for either speaker to answer.
Okay.
You know, my question was very similar. It's about the, you mentioned the controversy around the ICTY. I guess there's some additional controversy about some of the mechanics, about the maybe pressure from the U.S., maybe, I remember a long time ago reading about that the U.S. had some satellite photos that they didn't give. So I just, wanted to hear your opinion on, this more conspiratorial side of the controversy.
Okay, first I should have said this in the beginning. Views that I express here today cannot be attributable to the OSCE in any way. These are only my personal views, really. Like, that's important. I should have said it. As for the ICTY and these latest acquittals, I do believe that it had something to do with the states, with the United States, and that it had something to do with the responsibility of these big states who are involved in crimes today. So the concept, one of those acquittals was basically based on this standard of 200 meters in the case of Croatian generals. Whether or not it is illegal to hit a target that is a civilian target, and how far from the military object that target is. So if you can only target military objects during war, of course. But sometimes, of course, when you shell some place and you want to hit military targets, you also hit some civilian targets. So the ICTY said, if the civilian target that you hit is further than 200 meters from the military target. So this is the military target you're trying to hit, this is the civilian target. The civilian target is more than 200 meters away from the military target, and you hit the civilians, then you're committing a war crime. Just as simple as it gets. Anything below 200 meters around the military target is fine. And those Croatian generals, were basically convicted in the first instance trial before the ICTY. One got 24 years, the other one got 18 years. But then the appeals chamber, voting 3-2, acquitted all of them and said there is no such standard of 200 meters that the first instance trial chamber came up with. Which is probably true, but they didn't come up with another standard, so we don't know what the standard is. In that way, it might be helpful for the countries who are engaged in different wars throughout the planet to simply don't have any standard. You don't have a standard. And we are not going to come up with a standard, because if we do, then you might be held criminally responsible for something in the future, some of the big countries. When it comes to this Serb general, He was the chief of the Serbian army during the 1990s. And the first instance trial chamber of the ICTY rendered a sentence of 27 years because he was helping Bosnian Serb army, and through the ammunition and money and supplies that he was giving to Bosnian Serbs and Croatian Serbs, they were committing crimes. War crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and so on. And then again, the appeals chamber of the ICTY acquitted him, basically saying he wasn't supporting their crimes, he was basically supporting their war efforts. So their war efforts in itself were not criminal, so you can support somebody's war efforts, and that is what the United States and many other countries are doing in the world. You are supporting war efforts of a particular side in a conflict. But the problem is, if you know that that side is committing crimes, and usually you do, you have some evidence that the side you're supporting is committing crimes, then how can you continue to support that side? How can you continue to ship weapons to that particular war party? So, in my view, I don't have any evidence for this. I mean, that's just the rumors we get. One judge of the ICTY wrote an email, a private email to 56 of his friends. Closest friends, in which he basically stated that the new jurisprudence of the ICTY is changing and that it is benefiting countries like the United States or Israel in waging wars and so on. So I don't have a clear explanation why the ICTY jurisprudence is this way. Why this? It's basically the appeals chamber, and the president of the appeals chamber in those two cases was an American judge of Israeli origin, by the way. So I don't know. Maybe you can find a link, but I cannot be sure. I don't have any evidence to support my gut feeling.
I disagree with everything Dusan just said. Well, we don't have any evidence, so I'm just going to go with that. I think the following. I think that we really don't have any evidence. I think we have jumped to conclusions based on our deep dissatisfaction, our normative dissatisfaction with the fact that these people are now free, and we're trying to explain it somehow. We're trying to explain it away. I think when you actually look at the composition of the judges on the appeals court, there were different permutations. It's not as if like it was the three judges who acquitted everybody. There were different permutations. Some of the judges wanted acquittals in some cases, some wanted convictions in some other cases. So there's no pattern that I can see that this is the three judges that keep wanting to acquit people. I don't see that. I'm very nervous about Americans of Israeli origins claims in life. But as you're right, so much has been written about this, and this is what this judge who wrote this personal letter indicated and implied, again, without any evidence. His evidence in the letter is we hear rumors in the hallways. I hear rumors in the hallways all the time. I don't try to make big, overarching claims about it. I think, again, we are not capable. We're so unhappy with the acquittals, we're so unhappy with these people walking free, that we are incapable of making a very simple argument, which is some judgments are good, some judgments are bad. Sometimes there are judgments that we don't agree with in the process. Trayvon Martin, Zimmerman, anybody? This happens all the time. Some judgments are written poorly, some decisions are made poorly. That doesn't indicate a conspiracy, it means poor judgment. It means maybe lack of evidence. It means incompetency. I'm always very quick to believe in incompetency and very slow to believe in a conspiracy. One thing that I will add is that there was fear that these acquittals will now have a precedent strength in other international criminal tribunals, but we had a trial of Charles Taylor in the Sierra Leone court, where confirming his conviction, the court specifically said even with the latest evidence, even with the latest judgments of the ICTY, those judgments do not concern us. We have our own jurisprudence to make. We will not take the ICTY judgments as precedents. So in the next case where we could test whether this big precedent will now occur, the judges in Sierra Leone just shut it down. So that's where I'm at.
But can you explain the acquittal of Croatian generals?
Oh yeah, sure.
What's the explanation?
Sure. I think that the appeals chamber did not agree with the two. They thought that the lower chamber created this 200-meter thing out of thin air.
Okay.
And that is not an accurate new war doctrine. Based on that, we don't have any, because short of that 200 doctrine, you don't have really much of a case.
I profoundly disagree. This is the first time I hear this. I mean, there is plenty of evidence against these Croatian generals, and it's not just the 200-meter standards. You did read the opinions of judges who disagreed on the appeals chamber, who called these judgments as lacking any sense of justice. And you never have that wording of other judges who disagree with their colleagues. It's
you do on the Supreme Court all the time. I think. But I just want to make sure. I never said that I agree with all the judgments. I just said the courts make mistakes all the time. All I'm saying is I don't see a conspiracy.
No.
I actually think the Perisic case is the weakest. I think the thing that you just said, that the appeals court said that Perisic didn't know that they were committing crimes, that is very weak to me. But so again, I'm not saying that I agree with the reasoning. I'm just saying they make mistakes. It doesn't mean that the whole process is delegitimized.
Well, if you have a trial chamber, which is the first instance chamber, that sends somebody to jail for 24 years or 27 years, and all three judges on that chamber vote for that decision. And then you have the appeals process, and in the appeals process you have voting 3-2, with very strong wording of the two judges who disagree with the acquittal of the three judges in the appeals chamber. And there's something rather wrong in it. If you have basically 8 judges, and out of 8 of them, 3 in the appeals chamber vote for acquittal, and basically 5.
Right, but there were different 3. They all changed all the time. So all we know is that there's acrimony.
Maron didn't. In Perisic, there was Maron, that's the American judge. In Gotovina, it was Maron, the presiding judge of both chambers.
Was he in Haradinaj too?
No. Haradinaj was the first instance judgment.
Yeah.
But I don't have any evidence, but it looks suspicious to me.
This is fun. We're fighting. I love this. This is good.
Okay, Ashley and Emmett. Is there another hand behind them?
Yeah. Okay. And Rachel.
Okay, well, I just want to let you know I am quite depressed after this presentation because I had been writing a paper about Serbia, and at the end of it, I was feeling really optimistic, like yay, Serbia-Kosovo relations, and that's actually where my question actually goes to for you guys. I know we talked more about the ICTY and transitional justice, but do you think that the fact that it has been 20 years since the beginning of the wars, and it's now been 10 years since the end of them, that now within a country like Serbia, the fact that there are these relations now and negotiations between Serbia and Kosovo, that is actually a really positive sign, and that maybe perhaps through those sorts of negotiations that maybe talk of some of these atrocities would be able to be talked about like on a more state level? Do you think it would go in that direction, or is that too optimistic?
So we'll get another question.
You also mentioned that one of the obstacles to justice in these countries is just the fact that these different ethnic groups have been divided into separate states. But I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about how that panned out in Bosnia, which is very multi-ethnic, and has the division of the country into kind of a federal structure really served to isolate the populations.
Do you want a third question, or do we stick with 2? Okay.
Well, I have to be optimistic. This is very hard for me. Of course, this is good, and of course, the Kosovo-Serbia agreement is good news. I mean, there's no question about that. In some ways, I think that that Serbia really had not a choice. We talked about this last night, so maybe we'll yell at me for this as well, which will be fun. I think really I love this. I think that the Serbian government really didn't have much of a choice, because if they really are serious about getting into the EU, this is really it. So I think they were kind of backed until they were like, oh, okay. And I think that they're still continuing to send kind of cognitive dissonance message to the population. So Prime Minister Dacic had, in the same day, in the morning, he gave, for one audience, an interview where he said, of course, we have to recognize Kosovo. Kosovo was not part of Serbia for the last 10 years, so everybody's been lying to you. I'm going to be the one who's going to sell this and say this is correct. That same afternoon, he went to a university, I forgot which one, and gave a smaller talk to some university students where he said, even though we have recognized Kosovo, it's going to stay in our hearts forever, and we will always think of it as something that was taken away from us by force. Okay, so those are two things. Now that particular framing of the Kosovo negotiations is exactly the same as the public opinion. Overwhelming majority of the Serbian public says that yes, we need to recognize Kosovo if that's going to get us into the EU. But that same number also says, but I will never accept that as legitimate or fair. It's a new injustice. Okay, so I would be much more optimistic about the Kosovo agreement bringing out discussion of atrocities if Serbia gave up this idea on both territorial identity and ontological claim on Kosovo as something that is part of it. That idea has not been delegitimized. I don't see any effort, and Dusan's talked about this when we talked about the domestic war crimes, to actually talk about the atrocities of Serbian military and police against Kosovo civilians, including a major mass grave that's in Belgrade. Now, we were talking about this yesterday. I mean, I would think that if you talk about the major mass grave where Kosovo civilians are buried in Belgrade, under some ditch next to a big housing development, that you could, around that, build a story about what was done, how, and where. But there's really no discussion about that. Want to talk about Kosovo, and then I'll get to the other.
Well, since Jelena talked about Serbia's position, I would like to talk about Kosovo's position. Kosovo is worse than Serbia in many respects, including dealing with the past. They don't have any knowledge about crimes committed against the Serbs. A friend of mine from one NGO was doing a seminar with young Kosovars, Kosovo Albanians, and they gave them a story. And the story read, two armed men came to the house, took a young boy out of the house. His mother was watching all that. They took him 20 meters from the house and killed him there. So they asked young Kosovo Albanians, okay, so what do you think? Who's the perpetrator, who's the victim in terms of ethnic origin? And of course all of them said, well, the victim is an Albanian, of course. And they said, well, no, not really. This is a true story written by that mother, and the victim is the Serb. And young Kosovo Albanians said, well, why would the Serbs kill a Serb? They don't have the notion, any knowledge, that Kosovo Liberation Army killed hundreds of Serbs, and other Albanians also. Albanians who they thought were supporting Serb regime and so on. So there is a lack of trust on both sides, and I don't see war crimes issues opening anytime soon between Serbia and Kosovo. Even though victims associations of Serbs and Kosovo Albanians have, I would say, fine cooperation. They would even hold conferences together, which is somewhat new to the region, and it is positive. But politically speaking, I think this is the very beginning of the political dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia, and that we simply shouldn't expect too much at this point. Even this, in my view, what the Serbian government did is a revolutionary step. Engaging in Kosovo, engaging in dialogue with Kosovo in this way. This is unprecedented. And also, I just briefly wanted to say something about Bosnia, but I think in some ways it also relates to Macedonia. And that is also divided society between the West, where Albanians are the majority, and the rest of the country, where Macedonians are the majority. I think that we have these frameworks, these agreements. In Bosnia, it is the Dayton Agreement, and in Macedonia, it is the Ohrid Agreement. These agreements stopped wars. Basically, they were used for that. But those countries still live under those agreements. Dayton Peace Accords was in 1995. So Bosnia has been living under that regime for basically 18 years. But that framework was constructed to end the war and not to be a part of the Bosnian constitution forever. I think it really hinders Bosnia's chances of ever becoming a vital part of the region or a stable state. And that there should be some other framework now for Bosnia so that it can actually move on with the economic development and other things, political dialogue within Bosnia itself, and the same goes for Macedonia and the Ohrid Agreement.
Yeah, I think that's right. And on the Dayton Agreement for Bosnia specifically, the Dayton Agreement was created to stop the war, but what it did is it froze ethnic conflict in place, and in many ways it rewarded ethnic cleansing because it stopped the territorial expansion in time. So whatever Serbs conquered or controlled, they kept. So Srebrenica, the site of the massive crime of genocide, is now in Serb-controlled part of Bosnia. Okay, so think about just that injustice, if you will. And this goes with many other parts where many atrocities were created. So I completely agree. Short of a complete removal of the Dayton Accords and a new Bosnian constitution that would make it a unitary state, the conflict itself is frozen. Now, I don't think that I'm not that worried about renewed cycle of violence. I don't think that I don't think we have evidence that that we should be really afraid of Bosnia engulfing in a new civil war. I think the population is exhausted, poor, unemployment is a big problem. I think it would be very, very hard to motivate people to fight with actual weapons. But this is what people who want to keep this regime in place keep saying, well, if you remove the Dayton, we're going to fight again, which I just think it's disingenuous. So you were asking, in terms of partition, why is it that maybe Bosnia, that is by design multi-ethnic, why hasn't there been more facing the past from one side to another? But it's because they actually don't live together. Sarajevo, that used to be really multi-ethnic and multi-confessional, this was the largest Jewish minority in the former Yugoslavia. This is where the rates of interfaith marriages were 43%. Sarajevo is now predominantly a Bosniak city. Serbs live in what they call Srpsko Sarajevo, which of course everybody else calls East Sarajevo. And there are a lot of cities that are simply just one ethnicity. And so there was a big story about Srebrenica, for example, because Srebrenica, as I said, is controlled by the Serbs, and they have a Serbian mayor. And so some of the NGOs that are commemorating Srebrenica atrocity wanted to change the law to allow a Bosniak who doesn't live in Srebrenica to be the mayor, just to have kind of a symbolic representation of that city. And I think they managed to do that. But this is how hard it has gotten. So it's the society is incredibly divided. I mean, we talked about education textbooks reform. Bosnia still has 3 types of textbooks: Historia, Historia, and Povijest. These are 3 words for history. So in Serb Republic, they have Serbian textbooks that are imported from Serbia. In the Croatian part in Herzegovina, which is where more Bosnian Croats live, they use textbooks imported from Croatia. And in the rest of Bosnia, they use textbooks imported from Sarajevo. These textbooks have very different interpretation of what has happened. So if you don't even have unitary education, imagine how much more difficult and daunting the actual reconciliation process is.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
Oh, 3 questions.
Oh, sorry.
Let's do all 3. Great.
So my question is a little bit more broad about transitional justice. Given like kind of the shortcomings of the ICTY and these sort of special tribunals, do you think a different kind of structure would work better? Maybe kind of like, I'm thinking of this special court in Sierra Leone where it's based inside the country, maybe that gives a little more buy-in from the community and you can have better outreach with the public, or something where it's maybe international judges but applying domestic law, and therefore you wouldn't have the problems of where you wouldn't be able to charge them with lesser crimes. You'd be able to charge them with lesser crimes under domestic law, in theory. I was just wondering your thoughts in general about that.
Okay. So my question is getting back to the 3 levels of criminal responsibility you were talking about. So as far as the state level, so there was an attempt in, I believe it was 2007, the International Court of Justice, there was a case between Bosnia and Serbia, and this is the case that established that there was a genocide in Srebrenica, but that I believe Serbia wasn't responsible for it. So is this such a means that you have in mind as far as state responsibility? And maybe if you could comment on the outcome, do you think this was a failure to hold Serbia accountable for genocide?
My question is about the Truth Commission that you've talked about, establishing the Multi-Ethnic Truth Commission that would actually establish numbers of atrocities committed by each nation or each ethnic group. I'm wondering, because you've said that the conflicting narratives about these things have been perpetuated by intellectuals and perpetuated by these contradicting textbooks and school curricula and stuff. And I'm wondering, once the Truth Commission reaches its conclusions, how would you go about making sure that they actually influence these curricula and these intellectuals? Because it sounds like that is determined entirely by groups within the countries that possibly wouldn't be connected to this Truth Commission at all.
Well, the idea behind RECOM is that the idea behind RECOM is that the final report it issues will become part of history books in all countries, that it will become somewhat of a historical record. And the commission is supposed to be comprised of 21 persons. Those persons would come from different ethnic groups. The RECOM would be established by states through an agreement, international agreement basically. So if that final report has a state stamp on it, then it gives it some leverage, some importance in the society. It might not change the perspectives of this old intellectual elite, old guard, but it stands a chance to influence younger generations through those textbooks. And it won't be probably only textbooks, but of course the final report will probably have thousands of pages. And not everything can go into textbooks, but those basic facts will. And so that's the idea. If people from different countries, from different ethnic groups, assemble one report together which they agree on, and the states are behind them, because the states will nominate those people to the commission, each state will nominate its representatives to the commission, then somehow you would believe that those facts established by the commission will be accepted by all, or let's say by the majority. That's for RECOM. And for international courts, well, Bosnia had that system of international judges coming to Bosnia, applying a mixture of Bosnian and domestic, international and Bosnian laws. It had some success, but not too much, as it seems, because the European Court of Human Rights actually struck down some of its judgments, which is really, really bad, actually. but overall, we could not have international court established anywhere in the former Yugoslavia, because the ICTY was established in 1993 when no party to the war actually wanted to prosecute anybody for war crimes. They could only basically prosecute their own because they couldn't reach others, but they, of course, didn't want to prosecute their own. So the court had to be established some other place. And overall, I'm not really sure how much it is actually important for certain countries to have courts, international courts, in their own countries for crimes committed in their own countries, actually sitting there. For example, for Rwanda, sometimes people say the court should have been in Rwanda and not in Tanzania. I'm not really sure that for a regular person in Rwanda it really makes any difference if the court is in Kigali or Arusha. For them, Kigali is as far as Arusha in their heads, in their minds, and even how many people have actually been to Kigali from Rwanda, or it depends on the state. So in some cases it would be good to have an international court based in the state for which the crime it is involved in, but I'm not sure it is always the case.
Okay, so I'll take the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. So yes, you're right. There was a lawsuit that Bosnia brought on Serbia, 2007. Well, that's when it was adjudicated. It was brought on earlier, and this was the first case in the history of ICJ of one country suing another for genocide. And the court decided that Serbia was not guilty. But again, talking about judgments, this judgment itself was a little bit tortured. Because the judgment of the court said that they have evidence that Serbia knew and could have prevented Bosnian Serbs from committing genocide, but it's not guilty of committing genocide, which is kind of a logical gymnastics that you have to make. And actually, there were reports that came out very soon after this decision that there were much more incriminating documents proving Serbia's knowledge in the ongoing Milosevic trial, but that there was a deal made between the ICTY prosecution and the ICJ that they wanted to keep those documents and not release them, and so this was a little bit of a mess as well. There are actually ongoing cases of mutual genocide claims of Serbia suing Croatia and Croatia suing Serbia for genocide as we speak, like today. And I think that these are getting kind of a little bit into the silly season, because I think that there are other non-legal ways in which we could provide for state accountability. And I think, for example, that the new governments post-Milosevic in Serbia, post-Tudjman, could have politically made a big deal about creating a political clean break with the previous regime by showing readiness to accept responsibility or showing readiness to provide reparations, which they were always afraid to do. And so I'm thinking, for example, what better chance did President Obama had to make a clean break with the previous regime by not showing some clear separation and offering some kind of a responsibility of the United States, which he didn't do, and our cases that we discussed didn't. And I'm always, obviously these are pragmatic choices that politicians make, but it seems to me that this is such a good way to fortify your position as different, as creating this political break with the past that then really clearly separates you and even shields you from your own responsibility somehow. So I think that politicians are really missing out on an opportunity at these moments of transition, something that would maybe in the short term be very traumatic, but in the long term would really yield a lot of benefit.
Okay, I think that was the last word, and please join me in thanking Dusan and Jelena for this fantastic. And thanks to the audience, you guys were fantastic.